In fact, first of all, welcome to the LSE and for this hybrid event hosted by the European Institute. My name is Simon Glendinning and I'm the head of the European Institute and Professor of European Philosophy here. And I'm unbelievably pleased to be joined by and welcoming my colleague, Abby Innes, for this event to mark the launch of her new book, Late Soviet Britain, Why Materialist Utopias Fail. And I'm delighted to welcome Raphael Baer to the LSE for this event too, who will be in conversation with Abby. I'm going to introduce our speakers properly in a moment, but before I do, I want to ask those of you who are in the theatre if you could put your phones on silent if they're not already, so as to not disrupt the event. And you should know that the event is being recorded and hopefully will be made available as a podcast subject to no technical difficulties. There will be a chance for you to ask questions to both of our speakers here this evening. And for our online audience, you can submit questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please include your name and your affiliation, and Laura here will raise her hand on your behalf if you have questions online. For those of you in the theatre, I'll let you know when we open the floor for questions, and we have a microphone. Is there, Carolina, is there a roving mic around? Yeah, two. Okay, so we've got roving mics around. Just wait for the mic to get to you before you ask your question. For X users, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSEEI. So about our event today, I suppose the sort of guiding question is one that concerns everybody, which is something to do with the instability that seems to belong to liberal democratic politics in our time. The UK, historically one of the strongest and oldest liberal democracies in the world, how has it become so unstable? What's changed there? And in late Soviet Britain, Abby Innes is going to give an argument as to why this is happening to us. And it's about the way in which economic liberalisation has weakened the British state and ultimately broken some of its governing institutions. The crisis of democracy in rich countries, including Britain, has brought forward many analyses of neoliberal capitalism. And Abby is indeed joining that effort to understand what's sometimes called neoliberalism and the neoliberal revolutions. But she does so in a completely original way. What she wants to show is how the governing science in neoliberal revolutions fails for many of the same reasons that Leninist states failed too. So there's this some kind of analogy or homology or relationship between two, on the face of it, very, very different kinds of state setups or institutional setups that we have to see some sort of connection, and Abby will explain that in a brief introduction in a moment. But essentially, I think what she wants to say is that there's a kinship between them in that what she thinks that they're closed system forms of reasoning applied to open system realities. And there's a kind of shared conflict there between the kind of reasoning involved in their economics and the kind of realities that belong to our liberal democratic societies and obviously Soviet societies too. So Abby, she's Associate Professor of Political Economy in the European Institute here at the LSE, and she's published widely on the political economy of principally Central Europe in the past, and drew on that background for the comparisons with the Soviet and neoliberal economic regimes that belong to her book. In more recent years, Abby has focused her research on the political economy of the green transition, so issues around climate change rather than the neoliberalism. So I guess shifting heads somewhat here, but today it's the neoliberal issues. And Raphael Baer is a journalist and political columnist for The Guardian, formerly a correspondent in the Baltic region and Russia, and he will explain for himself how his own thinking has got involved with some of the things that Abby's concerned with in this book. And he's the author of the book, Politics, A Survivor's Guide, How to Stay Engaged Without Getting Enraged. So I'm nearly done. When I'm done, Abby will have a brief opportunity for an introduction, about 15 minutes, where she'll explain some of the central ideas of the book, and then there'll be a conversation between Abby and Raphael until we're done for about an hour or so into the event, and then we'll open it up for question and answers from you and from online. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Abby, who you get your 15 minutes of fame. Yeah.
So, thank you very much for coming, and particular thanks to kind of friends and family and my partner Vic, who has lived with this book for 6.5 years. So actually, he's probably better at summarizing it at this point than I am. So, and he's looked after me in an incredible way through this whole period. So I'm rather delighted that we've got to this point. Okay, so let me just say something very quickly about the genesis of the book. So as Simon says, my background is Central European politics and the political economy of Central Europe. And so I've written about the breakup of Czechoslovakia, party systems development, state system capture, all those kinds of things. But by a few years after the global financial crisis, it was becoming clearer and clearer in Britain that we were progressively dismantling the democratic institutions that I had been watching Central European democratic governments trying to construct ever since 1989. And the paradox of that, the perversity of that, was obviously fairly striking in itself. And then when we got to Brexit, I started feeling like one of my favorite cartoons, which is of an old guy sitting in his armchair by the fire, and he's got this very sort of scraggy dog in the corner, and he's got a newspaper and he's saying, I just want someone to tell me what the hell is going on. What the hell is going on? Do you know what the hell is going on? And I thought, that's me. That's how I'm feeling through this whole process. It was very expressive. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to try what I think is going on is state failure. I think Brexit is the wrong diagnosis of a real crisis, and that's a crisis of state failure. So that's where I started. That's where I applied for a wonderful British Academy Fellowship that gave me the freedom to go and think about it. And then something very strange happened, which is I started looking at state failure, and I started with public sector outsourcing. I think that was so obviously, in fairly deep trouble. And then it just hit me in the way that it hit Raphael in his beautiful book, Politics, A Survivor's Guide, where I was sort of thinking, it's also very Russian. I'm thinking, how is that possible? How is it possible that what I'm finding are failures in public sector outsourcing that feel deeply familiar from my years looking at the collapse of the Soviet economic system? How is that possible? So I was looking at all these practical policy areas, and everywhere I looked, there were resonances with Soviet pathologies. And what I kept thinking were these were Soviet state failures in capitalist form. But that's mad. These ideologies are completely opposed in their political values. And then I realized that I had given myself a much bigger task than I thought I had at the beginning, which was that to make sense of it, I was going to have to look at the economic metaphysics behind the neoliberal project and the economic metaphysics behind the Soviet economic system. And then when I'd done that and I discovered that they were essentially mirror images, they're basically both forms of deterministic closed system reasoning that ultimately come to the point of arguing that the economy is essentially like a watch, and that like God, the watchmaker, we can apprehend how it works. And obviously, on the face of it, those economic ontologies, those economic beliefs about reality are very contrasting. In Leninism, it's Marxist economic sociology, which has these long-range theories of the movement of classes through different stages of capitalism. And in neoclassical economics, it's about using mathematics as a road to the kind of universal laws of economic motion. so that you use mathematics to figure out how a rational economic man can navigate their way through commodity space. And economics allows you to do this in this pristine way, getting rid of empirical noise, but working logically through all the different frameworks of incentives that might exist in different markets, in different sectors, to give you this supposedly scientific understanding. So then, having got as far as saying, okay, these are mirror images, you then have to come up with an understanding of why they don't work and why they can't work in the terms by which they're justified. And that took me into the philosophy of science. So I kind of backed my way towards the beginning of the book, which is about the philosophy of science. And then it moves through to the metaphysics of these ways of thinking economically, and then through the really existing revolutions and their affinities through to the political outcome. And why can't they work? In philosophy of science terms, well, actually drawing on a Kantian tradition, which is also an LSE tradition in terms of Karl Popper, but also Thomas Kuhn's theory of scientific revolutions. The bottom line of that is the idea that you can't read history like the pages of a book of truth. It's just not available to you in that way, because our theories and concepts and the way we look at the world is always framed by the previous theories and ideas that got us to our current perspective. So the basic critical realist view in the philosophy of science is we can never escape the history of our own curiosity. And so we move in steps. We can never transcend the history of our own curiosity, so that there's some Archimedean point where you can stand in the world and ascertain all the factors and features that got you to the present. So not only is that the case, it's also the case that the future is always becoming something else, because wonderfully, we're imaginative. And actually, for better or worse, our freedoms live in our capacity to be imaginative. And also, it's the supreme virtue of democracies that they allow a society to continually become the next thing it's going to be in a very adaptive way, because it doesn't offer substantive blueprints for how to live. It offers procedures of governance that are based on inclusion and fairness and representation. So it's the ultimate adaptive system. It turns out it's not so adaptive when democratic political parties become utopian, which is where we've got to. So the problem with the fact that we're always becoming something else, that our imagination does that whenever there's emergent novelty in complex systems, it means the future is not going to be a statistical shadow of the past. So it turns out that it's not just the case that these machine models of the political economy, these deterministic closed system forms of reasoning, whether they're Leninist or neoclassical, it's not just that they don't work, that they won't work, because society will give them a constant source of surprise when you try and implement these deterministic theories. It's that they cannot work, they can never work, because it's in the nature of society that it isn't a closed system, it's an evolving, open-ended system. So why is this so incredibly important in terms of its later consequences in the British political system? Well, in terms of economic reasoning, after Thatcher, we ended up with what gets called first best world economic reasoning. So the free marketeers under Thatcherism on the right of the Conservative Party, very much believing that if the state withdraws, there's a kind of revealed prophecy of an efficient market, that competition, rational individuals, well-informed individuals will lead us to an ever greater efficiency in the way society is run. Now, New Labour adopted what is the mainstream position in academic economics, which is so-called second best world economics, which doesn't believe in the ideal, doesn't believe that it's possible to get a fully competitive free market with fully informed individuals, but it does believe that that is the useful benchmark for understanding where markets fail. So when you hear people talk about market failures in technical economic terms, but also in New Labour terms, what they really mean is all the junctions of information asymmetries or missing markets or collusion in markets, or all the things that might disrupt competition in its idealized form. Which sounds great, that sounds more realistic, except it's no more metaphysically neutral than the really utopian version, because the underlying conceit is that if you mend those points of market failure, you drive the market towards, you mend the connections, you drive the market towards its coherent competitive whole. But the coherent competitive whole is a fiction. It's a thought experiment. It's not something you could ever produce in the real economy, because we are an evolving, open-ended, imaginative society that is three-dimensional, and it doesn't work in logical mathematical time. It works in historical time and tends to develop its own dynamics. So the dark historical joke that comes out of that comparison is an explanation of why neoliberal societies like the UK and Soviet systems converge on the same forms of statecraft, which are quantification, output planning, forecasting, budgets, well-defined budgets that go forward into the future, correct managerial lines, beliefs in the productive, rational nature of enterprises, because these are the governing arts, if you like, that make sense in a machine world. And that begins to give you the foundations of why neoliberal systems reproduce Soviet state failures in capitalist form. So what I then do in the middle of the book is talk about the applied, so how does this play out in kind of applied terms? And so I have a whole chapter on new public management, where I look at public sector outsourcing, privatization, and agentification, delegated governments, where they try to delegated governance, where you try to make the civil service look more like competitive firms. It's like a theatre of competitive markets within the state. But to just take outsourcing, so the rhetoric around outsourcing is that you'll create consumer choice with a competitive market of providers. And that comes out of neoclassical models, where the state is this kind of theoretical setter of a market game that is then modeled in either formal mathematical or formal logical terms, where competition arises. The organized forgetting in that model is that the state doesn't disappear, it doesn't wither away. It's still there. And in fact, the only market for the only actual financial transaction in outsourcing is the market for procurement. So it's between the state and the outsourcing company. So instead of creating this nirvana of a competitive market for public goods and public services, what you recreate is the Soviet enterprise planning architecture, but in a capitalist form, where the state becomes a giant of enterprise management, but those enterprises are now profit-taking and under pressure from financial markets for those profits to be continuous. And you also have a problem that the Soviets had gone through for decades, which is the problem of incomplete contracting. The more complex the service, the more complex the task, the less able you are to write a contract that protects the buyer, because you can't anticipate all the information that you're going to need in this complex adaptive service. So almost immediately, the company, whether it's Serco, G4S, Intraserve, you name it, has more information about what they're doing than the state. And that asymmetry of information gets worse and worse over time, as it did in the Soviet system. So the state, as in the Soviet system, finds itself in bargaining games with private companies that it can never win. So I look at academy schools, the quasi-market argument from New Labour, in fact, that the Conservatives then pull wide open to have outsourcing, say, public finance, but private provision of markets in the welfare state. Academies, likewise, it was theorized that the state would set up these competitive academy schools. Parents would have parental choice between competitive schools. You would have rising quality, declining cost, because the efficiency gains of competition. It would be great, except the state doesn't wither away, it doesn't disappear. The state ends up with 3,500 contracts between the Secretary of State and academy schools. LEAs, local education authorities, are stripped of a lot of their powers, even though that's where all the economies of scale are in terms of managing the school's estate, planning, transport around schools, human resources, you name it, that's where the economies of scale are. So again, you recreate the Soviet planning architecture, but now for schools. And what you also get is the Soviet dynamic, where when it becomes clear that the model doesn't work the way it's supposed to, and the state remains politically, financially, and legally liable for failures in the provision of education, what can they do? Well, they do what the Soviets did, which is to create this burgeoning exoskeleton of remedial regulation to try and fill the informational gaps and audit the system and get feedback loops of information that aren't provided and dealt with in the supposedly perfect competitive price mechanism. And so when Michael Gove said that he would liberate the school system from the blob, you know, the bureaucratic state, the socialist leviathan of local authorities and educational establishments and central government bureaucracy, schools would be free to do all these things, free to run their finances, free to recruit. What he actually did was create the worst of both worlds. So you have non-competitive markets. The economies of scale need to be higher. So actually you've gone from individual academy schools to multi-academy trusts. So the original justification for choice and competition disappears because multi-academy trusts run schools in the entire county. Quite often you've gone from statute law to contract law, so parents have no accountability. Those schools game targets in the way that Soviet planners, Soviet enterprises used to game targets, so challenging students are excluded at disproportionate rates. Lower attainment students get neglected. You get all these dynamics, but then you also get this bureaucratic exoskeleton, and Ofsted reports with 73 sub-criteria of rules that need to be conformed to. So you end up with this incredible retention crisis of teachers because they find themselves in a bureaucratic education system that is far more centralized and regulated than anything from the 1970s, which was the period we were all supposed to be escaping. Finally, in the practical bit, I get to climate change as a discussion about future public risk and the idea in neoclassical economics that you can calculate risk, that we live in a computable world as opposed to a world defined fundamentally by uncertain. And as climate scientists will tell you, there's nothing more uncertain than the feedback loops within ecological collapse and the magnitude and the timing of those collapses. And yet what I show in that is that we're still in the world of the efficient markets hypothesis and the idea that competitive markets can internalize these risks, calculate the probability of those risks in an accurate way. And so we don't really need to do anything in a very active way in terms of climate policy. We can delegate it, continue to delegate it to the market, which is an extraordinary conceit. The global financial crisis taught us that markets are pretty bad at calculating risk in an accurate way. How much more of a conceit to imagine that you could superimpose the thought experiment of neoclassical economics onto the biosphere and understand the value of everything that occurs in the ecosystem. That would truly be godlike knowledge. So where does all that leave us politically? Well, at this point, you would think the comparison should collapse. Soviet communism was a totalitarian system in a one-party state that was extremely oppressive in a variety of ways right up until its collapse. Neoliberalism in Britain took place in open societies, some of the most free and fair elections, most open societies in the world, one of them. And yet, it's the distinctive feature, I argue, of materialist utopias that they must proceed through revolutionary idealism, the Thatcherite period, failure, the beginning of real social dislocation, of failure of policy to play out the way it should, doctrinaire remedial action, the attempt to make more inclusive regimes. Blairites are a bit like the Khrushchev era. How do we, in a technocratic way, make this a more inclusive kind of period? To resilient failure, continuing to decant public authority and revenues into the private sector, tweaking market failures as you go, but basically failing to deal with these emerging new system dynamics, just as the Soviets failed to deal with their emerging real system dynamics, to the point you get to real systemic decadence and ideological and systemic crisis, which is where we are now. And you also get to political economic regimes, both here and in the Soviet system, that are a grotesque caricature of the regimes that were promised. And also economic models that are doomed to undermine themselves in practice. So Prussian 19th century heavy industrial models in the Soviet system that were clearly ever less sustainable. And for us, it's rentier capitalism and excessive financial extraction, where we've basically organized a form of corporate state capture as a matter of public policy, which takes a certain kind of genius. So Brexit, I understand as an attempt to complete the revolution by the most radical free marketeers in the Conservative Party. It is, if you like, an attempt at Bolshevik neoliberalism after 35 years of failed Menshevism. And it's one thing to believe that in utopian ideas at their inception, but after 35 years of their systemic failure, you would think a degree of intellectual humility would make you question the kind of underlying ideas. So nationalism, it's often been argued, was the last stage of communism, but I also think it's the last stage of neoliberalism, because what Brexit effectively was the mirror image of socialism with a nationalist inform and socialist content, which was the Leninist strategy of the beginning of the Russian Revolution. We had nationalist inform but libertarian in content, and now we have libertarianism in one country, which is a mirror image of the Stalinist sort of vanguardist argument for socialism in one country, given the surprising absence of world revolution. So the thing I would point out is that Boris Johnson was a symptom, not a cause, because a more, again, intellectually self-reflecting Conservative Party should have asked itself, what was it about the underlying political economic regime that made an amoral fabulist their best electoral bet? But they went with that rather than with Rory Stewart, who was already beginning a far more one nation sort of critique of the inadequacy of the policies and their failure and how they got there. So like the late Soviet system, and I've got colleagues here like Sarah who know the Soviet history extremely well, we end up in the theatre of the cruel and absurd as it becomes impossible to run political affairs and kind of popular political arguments on the basis of the economic strategy. So you have to shift increasingly to charismatic nationalist arguments as the only space that is viable, and it's either that or recant. So to stop there, and I should really stop there, as the Poles used to say, the situation is terminal, but not serious. At which point I'll start talking to Raphael.
I'm going to very happily hand over to Raphael, who can explain his presence here as well.
Well, first of all, I'm presuming I can hear myself being amplified, so this microphone is definitely working. I'm going to begin just by doing my own little advertisement for the book, because, I mean, as you know, well, I was a correspondent in various parts of the former Soviet Union. I was just about old enough to have visited the Soviet Union when it was still the Soviet Union in its stagnation period. And I remember very clearly, quite recently, in the sort of the heat of the Brexit tumult, having that moment, that epiphany, thinking there's something very weirdly Russian about what's going on here, and I can't put my finger on it. I kept thinking, is this a column I could write? Is this something I could do? And then, lo and behold, you come across and you turn up. Not only do you make the argument that I've sort of got nebulously, journalistically, incoherently forming in my head, but you attack it with such academic rigor and sort of copper-plated so brilliantly with all the analysis. I thought, okay, I don't now need to do this because it's all there written down. Which, again, because journalists are lazy, that's always a win. I actually came at it though from the other way, which is I remember being struck because Brexit was so obviously utopia. I remember reading a sort of Dan Hannan piece in the Telegraph where he said, on the by 2020, this is what we'll have, and he described this extraordinary world where industry had been, manufacturing had been revived, and a renaissance, but we were also leading the world in AI and various other technologies, and poverty had been eliminated. And it really reminded me of those early Bolshevik idealistic presentations of what would happen when we reached communism. And the interesting thing is, with neoliberalism, if you go back to 1979, or earlier, but if you talk about the Thatcher revolution being instrumental here, there's less of that sense of there is a fixed destination that we will get to in our lifetime. It's not articulated so much as a clear place that you can actually get to, is it?
I think that's right, although you do have, so one of the disconcerting things that I had through the book was I kept finding Thatcher quotes that were exact mirror images of Leninist or so that's right, the determinism is not so obvious. And I think that's partly in the nature of the idea that the market is the natural revealed prophecy to which we're returning. We're returning to our...
Well, it's equilibrium, isn't it? You write very well about this sense that the Homo economicus will, when you enact the doctrine correctly, you get this sort of seamless automaticity of people functioning in market situations, which can keep going on forever. So there's not a sort of fixed end point where you've arrived.
Yeah, exactly. The idea, the conceit that the more you bequeath, the more you return power and authority to the market, the more effectively self-regulating it will be. Now, depending on whether you come from the Austrian school, and Thatcher was very influenced by Hayek, or the neoclassical school, which turns out to actually be the only practical one for sorting out policy, you have a sort of different understanding on how that price mechanism works and how it perpetuates itself. But I think Thatcher also had a very strong conviction that we were an enterprise. One of the things that made her so effective politically was not selling this in utilitarian terms, sort of scientific terms, but in the much more charismatic terms of returning us to our enterprising culture. This would take us back to our natural entrepreneurialism, our natural ingenuity.
Which is where there's a very nationalistic seat, though, isn't it? There is a uniquely British genius that means that Thatcherism and that doctrine will take root here in the way that it wouldn't perhaps in France or Germany.
And it's an extraordinary argument to sort of say, we have this genius as a trading nation, because one of the things you have to do is also edit out the naval supremacy and colonial violence and imperial history that made us quite as successful as a trading nation as we were. But obviously that wasn't part of the argument. The argument was this is a feat in our genius.
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? Sorry, because you mentioned Hayek, and the underlying, sort of the core of the sort of Hayekian ethical argument against state control is essentially that it tends automatically towards tyranny, because if you have to do a certain amount of repression of economic liberty to try and equalize, and then that ends up becoming a kind of political repression because you're sort of going against the grain of human nature. And what I find interesting is that as a critique of the Soviet system, that was entirely plausible, and was very effective. And it's almost as if you chart this revolutionary moment in 1979, but it's really after 1989, I feel that you lost the counterweight of the Soviet example, and then suddenly this ethical argument about why you don't have an overmighty state almost sort of breaks free of its moorings in the real world and becomes this much more sort of turbocharged sort of hallucination of the kind of future you can have.
Well, and the Hayek thing is interesting because there are different reservoirs of neoliberal thought. And the Austrian school, Hayek is very important as a critic of the Soviet system, but also by extension of neoclassical, very neoliberal, pro-market neoclassical reasoning, because he's basically a philosopher of knowledge. He basically says we are inescapably seeing the world through a glass darkly. And the price mechanism is virtuous, not because it can really solve that, but because it's the most effective way of ensuring freedom, because people can use their inescapably imperfect knowledge in markets to make free choices. Whereas the state will tend to violate that freedom and for various reasons sort of crowd itself out. So Hayek's vision of the future is that you would have only the best social traditions. Interesting argument as a woman, you're like, which ones are they? Only the best social traditions that will create social sort of stability, the rule of law, very important to have property rights and the rule of law, but then a kind of maximal market. But and he ended up giving up on neoclassical economics because he also said, look, this mathematical idea that you're going to be able to compute every situation and he thought the realism, that there was a complete failure of realism, that you could do all that as a logical thought experiment, but that it was a really poor descriptor of how the real world would work. The trouble with Hayek, if you're a neoliberal government, is he offers you a great critique of the state, but because he was so idealistic about the price mechanism and tradition, is absolutely useless as a source of public policy from going from an established state to a more free market state. And then neoclassical economics is brilliant because depending on its assumptions, it can give you almost any prediction about how a given policy will play out. So neoclassical economics becomes the governing science. And Hayek is revered as this philosopher of freedom, but he's not a lot of use for really existing neoliberalism. Sorry, I wanted to pick up this thing about the unrealism of Dan Hannon's, the Fata Morgana of the libertarian Brexit reality. One of the darkly, you would come across with sort of darkly ironic analogies. So Khrushchev had announced that the socialist period, where you were constructing socialist consciousness and the wealth created by central planning, would get you to communism by 1980. It's rather imprudent to say when it would happen, because at that point the state is meant to wither away completely to leave this fully spontaneous society. And because it hadn't, somewhat embarrassingly, shown any signs of doing that, in 1971, the Soviet Party had to invent a wholly unexpected new period of historical materialism called developed socialism, which we'd never heard of before, but it was the thing you were then going to have to get through before you got to the communist period. There was going to be a slight pause in historical sort of materialism. And it seems to me that Brexit is the British equivalent of developed socialism, because it gives you it's a new artificial horizon for the dawning of neoliberal wealth and prosperity.
Well, what's interesting about the way Brexit was applied ideologically and where it felt much more explicitly utopian to me is the easy availability of enemies and saboteurs who could stop you getting there, because that was so essential to, especially throughout the Soviet period. Ultimately, if you have a utopian project and you have a destination, and as you described brilliantly, your model is going to be challenged by the complex reality of human society, and therefore you're setting yourself up in political opposition to the reality of the way humans behave. You are therefore your policy is therefore going to fail, and you're going to get into this vicious circle where you need an explanation for failure, which still fits into your ideological system, and its saboteurs and its foreigners. Always where you end up with on that. And Brexit went through that cycle very, very quickly. And it was in your book I came across this brilliant phrase I hadn't seen before. You talk about the combat stance. Is that right? The combat stance. Combat tasks. That's right. Because all the combat tasks, and how does that sort of explain more precisely that phenomenon?
So I'm actually going to. There's a wonderful sociologist called Veljko Vujacic who's written about the nationalist history, basically the breakup of the USSR and Yugoslavia, and his quote is so perfect that I'm not going to attempt to say something else. Veljko says, and see if this resonates, this is about the late Soviet system. In organizational terms, the defense of the state or the nation becomes a substitute combat task that can potentially restore the institutional integrity of the party by providing the cadres with a new sense of mission and well-defined institutional targets in a radically changed social environment. For the more orthodox cadres deeply steeped in a combat ideological ethos, such a struggle against external enemies and internal traitors is, in any case, just a continuation of the revolution in a new historical context. Desperately needed popular support is simulated, manipulated, and partially created. New opportunities are opened up for deflecting the responsibility for the economic failures of late socialism from the proletarian vanguard itself to various external and internal enemies. The newly manipulated consensus that is thus created can serve to substitute, in Jowett's excellent phrase, the national unity of elite and citizens for the real political equality between them.
And this is what's fascinating is in parallel with that, and this again supports your. I mean, it's not an analogy; it's much more sophisticated than that, but supports the argument you're making so well. Is that alongside that sort of fanatical ideological aggression that you have to assume to essentially identify who are the enemies that are preventing you from achieving your utopian goal. You also have this process by which the people who are in the apparatus, who have essentially blessed with the ideological vision to lead the people, arrogate into themselves the role of voices of the people, of sort of emanations, incarnations of the popular will, which, once you realize you're not going to get to your destination, becomes a fantastic license for corruption, because you basically get to say, well, we get to this, we're going to allocate the resources, we're going to be in charge of how this works because we have this vanguard position. And this is, again, it struck me during the pandemic, watching some of the things that were going on and some of the things we've subsequently learned, that Britain doesn't conventionally think of itself as a particularly corrupt society for all sorts of cultural and historical reasons. But that combination of venality and moral arrogance about why you're doing what you're doing felt incredibly Bolshevik to me, incredibly Soviet.
And underpinned by the logic that turning what was public authority and revenue into a transactional setup is somehow progress, because it fits more within the language of markets, even if the gains are pretty private. But I was very struck in the Owen Paterson case, for example. He said, I value my integrity very deeply. And that's not such an enormous contradiction if you are a strong neoliberal, because you consider yourself existing in an ideally transactional world where state norms are seen as problematic a priori.
Yeah, so once you've taken it, once you've understood that the institutional norms that have been around for decades that might be imposing checks and balances on your behaviour are counter-revolutionary, and this is, so civil servants are kulaks and need to be crushed, then of course it becomes automatic that the choice that you made to satisfy your own particular appetite conveniently also turns out to be in service of the revolution.
And the incredible naivety of what we've done, I mean, astonishing naivety of what we've done, comes back to this idea that businesses, as in Soviet enterprises, the private businesses in free markets, are only ever stewards of productive wealth building. That's all they do. They can't do anything else. They would never dream of doing anything else. And so the idea of making the state more efficient is that where you can't privatize, you must bring business expertise as kind of the vanguard of correct consciousness into the state wherever possible. So in British public policy making today, from agenda setting to policy development, policy articulation, to its drafting through to its implementation, private business actors and the fields of business around them, lawyers, accountancy firms, PR companies, and so on, are engaged in that process all the way through. But the extraordinary thing about that is we have created chronic corporate state capture throughout the British system as a matter of policy. I mean, in Russia, you have to kind of bribe and kill people to get this kind of access. But in our naivety, we have assumed that because they can only be a progressive force, this reformation of the state can only take us closer to the efficiency.
I love that there's actually a barren liberty of Richmond and Siberia, and just walked into the upper chamber of the House of Parliament. Not that I'm accusing him of having done anything untoward.
Well, we would never
suggest any such thing. I'm sure he's a fantastic legislator. I want to come back to this process of the question of what would the checks and balances necessarily be, and the ease with which they appear to have been sidelined or debilitated, because we talked about, I mentioned the civil service, you talked about law and in constitutional arrangements. You write about in the book the prorogation of Parliament is a fascinating example of something that turns out to have been a very flimsy check on Boris Johnson's power, although the Supreme Court, perhaps you could argue the opposite, did what it was supposed to do and return Parliament. But there's also culture which, in theory, if you have a deeply ingrained democratic culture, which Britain believes itself to have, that ought to impose some kind of restraint on wild bouts of ideological fancy. And I was struck, going back to Margaret Thatcher, David Willetts wrote something very interesting in the 90s, actually, after Thatcher had gone, saying that, and he knew her pretty well, and saying that because she was actually a very pious, very devout woman, and a Methodist Christian, she never thought that people would use their economic liberties in sort of hedonistic or venal ways. She thought there would be an automatic sense of moral constraint and austerity, because once you had enough, what more would you need? Which, I mean, it seems fantastically naive and also a different kind of ideological hybrid. But there was I suppose there was a pragmatic element to Thatcherism in that respect, wasn't there? That it didn't, it was less utopian in the sense that it was always trying to accommodate to the complexity of what society of Britain actually was, or what at least she thought it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think Thatcher is a pragmatist in the way Lenin was a pragmatist, in the sense that they were both politically brilliant in lots of ways. They could read the environment in which they were in. They understood where you took one step back in order to make steps forward, and that is in stark contrast to someone like Liz Truss, for example. So one of the oh my God, this can't be happening moments for me was when I was writing the bureaucracy chapter, because one of the things, it's in the nature of neoliberalism and Soviet ideologies as utopian mirror images, that they both have an identical critique of bureaucracy. Because it's the bureaucracy in a liberal bourgeois democracy that is seen as the real seat of power. In the materialist analysis, so in the Soviet analysis, bureaucracy is an expression of bourgeois class interest that is permanent, it's always there. So it's always expressing the interest of the elite through state structures. In the neoclassical critique of the bureaucracy is, because they're imposing economic logic onto all institutions. So by that logic, the bureaucracy is a monopoly. It's like a monopoly firm. And because it's a monopoly, everyone in it can exploit their monopoly power to build ever-increasing fiefdoms until you get totalitarianism, which crowds out liberty. But because they have the mirror image critique of bureaucracy, they end up using exactly the same language in that critique. So Margaret Thatcher wrote a speech, I think in 1976, where she talks about how the state under the post-war order, which is infected by socialism, has become the master and not the servant of the people. And that's a phrase that Frederick Engels used, exactly, the state has become a master and not the servant of the people, which is why Lenin uses the quote in The State and Revolution. So you keep bumping into the same language because it's the only language you can use to make the argument that the bureaucracy is it's not a barbarian bureaucracy, it's not an emanation of modernism where you need more complex organization to manage more complex societies, that you need to hold to account, very pragmatic barbarian analysis. It's the thing that stands in the way of the utopia that the
blob.
revealed. It's the blob.
But the fascinating thing, I mean, anyone who dealt with the Soviet Union, was well aware that the state had not withered away. I mean, you associate in so many of its failures with bureaucracy, and so much of the stupidity. And I use that word, advisedly, not as an insult to certain people. I think institutions and cultures can do stupid things because the incentives are there, especially in the bureaucracy. If you want to please your boss, you want to meet the target. There's no incentive to criticize the system if you get rewarded for ideological purity. So you can end up you end up with sort of breaking forward type policies that are very, very obviously insane, but within the microcosm of your environment make perfect sense for you and the advancement of your ambition. And I'm interested, you mentioned Weber, and I suppose the counterpoint to the sort of the anti-blob view of bureaucracy would be this Weberian idea that actually people can have a vocation to public service. And that can be both as elected practitioners, but also as civil servants. And I know a lot of civil servants, and I'm a bit biased here, but by and large, there's smart people who go into it, because they want to do the right thing. And I said there was a question coming here. What I find fascinating is this sort of paradoxical sense that these ideologies are so darkly cynical about human nature because they assume that everyone is being so mechanistically economistic about maximizing interest, and you have to try and manage that sort of almost sort of amoral force in human nature to try and get a better outcome for humanity. They don't consider the possibility that it's just ordinary humans might be quite decent and do the right thing. And yet they also purport to be idealistic about humanity.
Brilliant. And so it's not just that the British state was more Weberian, kind of following national legal norms, but one of the great virtues of the British state, one of the tragedies of having dismantled the post-war state in so many ways, was that it was built on the Haldane principles from 1918 that the state should attempt to use the scientific method. And what that meant was that it should try and build expertise and capacity throughout its offices that would be tasked with problem solving in the Kuhnian understanding of normal science. Now, Kuhn's understanding of normal science was not that when we make a scientific discovery, we approach the truth, capital T, because he didn't believe, because the philosophy of science kind of tells us this, that that's not humanly possible. What it does is it allows you to become better and better at problem solving. Normal science is getting better at problem solving. That's the idea. And the post-war values of the British civil service were to build the capacity for practical problem solving. So it was very empiricist. It used the scientific method, hypothetical deduction. You go out into the world, you observe what isn't working, try and figure out the patterns of why it's not working, and then you try and build structures that will answer those problems. And Gwyn Bevan is sitting here, who's written a beautiful book called How Did We Get to This? How did Britain get to this? And it's an encyclopedia of the problem-solving capacity of the post-war state and how we've slowly and then very quickly frittered that away in the neoliberal era. So it's an extraordinary sort of compendious account of really what we've lost in that sense. And the irony of our governing science that we've had for 40 years and that New Labour have adhered to in this nominally more critical way versus the Thatcherite version is it's against the scientific method. It's axiomatic deduction. It's argument from assumption, not argument from observation.
There's a great joke in the book, which you can probably tell better. Can I tell the great joke? So I'll probably get it wrong, but so basically, and sorry if you heard this. So a physicist, a chemist, and a neoclassical economist find themselves stranded on a desert island, and a tin of soup washes ashore. So all they've got to eat, there's no way to get into the tin. And the physicist says, I can use the rays of the sun to try and melt the seal on the tin. And the chemist goes, I can use the salt in the salt water to corrode the tin open. And the neoclassical economist says, first, assume a tin opener. That's what I did. I
love that joke. I think Nick Barr might have taught me that joke about 30 years ago.
Because economics is not a science. Yeah, I'm not going to say that to insult any economists in the present. Let's see, I have to be asked about economics. But the testable hypothesis, it's a complicated analytical tool. Not a perfect method for predicting objective facts. And what I find interesting, when you set a liberal, what is broadly a liberal democracy, the UK, against what was definitely not an authoritarian and sometimes totalitarian regime, the Soviet Union, side by side, and you make this comparison, what ought to be fundamentally different between them, and is, as an experience of living in them, is the corrective mechanism of political pluralism. That you ought to, the fact consulting people from time to time ought to essentially check the stupidity, because people will do terrible things that you wouldn't be able to get away with doing greatly forward because the government would be kicked out. Why has that mechanism not worked?
Okay, so, that's a great question. I mean, I think so. It was one of the particular features of the Soviet system because it was a state system. The coordinating mechanism was the state. When the state failed, everybody knew that it was failing. And when attempts to reform the state failed, everyone knew that the reforms had failed. But it's in the nature of a process of consistent marketization that the impact of state failure impacts different groups in society very differently by age, region, ethnicity, gender, that it's happening in an open society where there are multiple different arguments that might be made for why it's going on. I think COVID,
whose fault it is.
and whose fault it is. And COVID was interesting in that respect because state failure had been experienced by people dependent on the state for years already, but COVID taught everybody that the state was failing. So it revealed a lot of things that had been blindingly obvious to people with disabilities and other requirements of state support over the period. So I think one of the main reasons it hasn't worked is the bipartisan consensus, the fact that the Labour Party moved away from its post-war traditions of a structural critique of capitalism as an historical evolving system to a critical second best world neoclassical view that said, no, we can mend market failures. We can get the best of markets and states because we have the governing science that would allow us to make these technocratic corrections of microeconomic failure. And so even though they made a lot of improvements, I mean, they genuinely did, things like Sure Start were an enormous success. There were some wonderful aspects of New Labour, not least their social politics was distinctly less divisive than those today. But they nevertheless presided over continuing decanting of public authority and revenues into the private sector, which then systematically failed to exhibit the virtues presumed that it would have. And I think the flip side of that, the flip side of a sense that, all parties, the idea that parties are essentially the same, even though they're really not, but I think that trope has gained resonance because there is this sense that neither of them step outside of the whale. Right?
That would also sort of support the idea that there's an inflection point in 1989, 91, where previously the fact of the Cold War on two levels, both as there being a coherent ideological alternative that people could choose. They might, between the two Germanys, it was pretty clear which one you'd rather live in, but there are plenty of people who still got that choice wrong, in the West. But there was a rival doctrine that you had to be sort of and iterative in your relationship to. So that and whereas once that's gone, I think that's partly explains the New Labour phenomenon in the sense that it ultimately it was very hard to politically, culturally make the case for a critique of capitalism, where capitalism had massively, comprehensively won and was doing a victory lap of the entire world. But also, I think, just in terms of defence spending and other requirements, essentially making sure you didn't have a very angry proletariat, all sorts of things about the Cold War dynamic meant you had to have quite big states. And it was much easier to win a politics of let's shrink the state when you didn't have the Soviet Union sitting there representing the alternative.
I think that's right, but one of the tragic ironies of what we've done is that we've created a state that is much closer to the caricature of the original neoliberal critique than the post-war state ever was. So the state is bigger, more rigid, more bureaucratic, more expensive, and more intrusive than it ever was in the post-war period. And that is the irony. We've created the opposite of what was intended. And it's just the flip side of the kind of wider the checks and balances work. I think almost the most dangerous point that we're at is that because we've grown up, I mean, I was 11 when Margaret Thatcher was elected, we've grown up under neoliberal ideology, but in an open system, so we don't know how indoctrinated we are. I mean, the Soviets had to go through endless initiation ceremonies to try and inculcate the spirit of the Soviet worker. But in everyday life, we use the language of saying, are you investing enough in your relationships or in your productivity? Are you living your best life?
This is so good. One of the features of things I wanted to ask you is we talk about liberal democracy, but you're describing neoliberal conditions. And I was wondering what you think is, as it were, the neoliberal subject, the one that inhabits that space increasingly, and we do, and how that would contrast to, as we're more classically speaking, a liberal subject.
Well, I mean, Foucault wrote these lectures on biopolitics in Paris in 1979, and he has this wonderful description of the neoliberal subject, and it's the beginning of a whole literature about the nature of neoliberal subjectivity, and I can't remember the exact quote, but it's along the lines of, so each man will be an entrepreneur unto themselves.
Yeah.
You know, they'll sort of realize the world unto themselves, and it's the free market version of the socialist citizen who is the cog in a well-working machine, but in a price mechanism where the whole production regime is sort of disappeared behind these nice mathematical models, but ultimately that will tend towards this perfect system of allocative efficiency. In truth, the neoliberal subject is no more allowed an unexpected imaginative thought than his Soviet or her Soviet or their Soviet counterpart.
What's fascinating is that critique has been taken up by sort of post-neoliberal conservative thinkers as well. I think it was the Nick Timothy argument and others that will essentially say there is this over-individualistic, consumerist view of what the self is, and that becomes a critique of what they think of as sort of woke ideology, whatever that means. It's quite hard to define, but the sense that once people become kind of constantly obsessed in the market for self-actualization and defining their individuality and from this sort of multiple choices and arrogating rights to themselves in exactly that quality, they cease to be a proper society and all the traditions fall away. So you get this reactionary conservative critique of liberal consumerism.
But what they're trying to do is shift the debate onto the ground of the nationalist combat tasks. So they're not trying to return us, I don't think, to what would be a fully three-dimensional liberal citizen. So the image that comes into my head is that we're like Roadrunner, you know, we're like the Disney cartoons who've been steamrolled flat by a two-dimensional ideology, and it becomes a deeply political act as individuals for us to kind of pat ourselves back into our three dimensions and say, no, I am three-dimensionally human. I am generous, I am fallible, I'm vulnerable, I'm all the things that I am really not allowed to be in this system that requires me to be this self-optimizing aspect of efficiency. And
I think you are also questionable.
Yeah.
Because that's going to happen right now. Stand up only so that I can see people, because I can't see very much down there. But we do now have chance. We've got one mic here and another mic here. So if you put up your hand, and I can see lots of you want to speak, so it is good that we're giving space here. And we're going to start down here, and we'll take a second one over there. And do it one at a time to start with, and then we'll collect if it's going badly.
Thank you, Abby. That was absolutely wonderful. So I'm going to be cheeky and ask two questions, but one is kind of frivolous, but I just want a little bit of hope. So the Soviet Union did collapse in 1991. So I know you don't like anything being mechanistic, so you won't tell us, but, you know, can we hope eventually for the collapse of this neoliberal regime that we're all enjoying? That's my kind of trivial question. And my slightly more serious question, I was just wondering, because I'm, you know, interested in gender and care. So in the kind of Soviet thinking, you put all of that into the public sphere. It's completely devalued. And then in neoliberalism, I guess you put it into, it's all marketized, but I'm just kind of wondering your thoughts about, you know, the different ways in which these two systems deal with care and whether that leads to particular contradictions.
Thank you so much. We forgot that you're to identify yourself.
Oh, my name is Sarah Ashwin and I'm from the management department.
Brilliant.
It's a specialist on the Soviet.
Brief response, then we can keep going with questions.
Really, this book makes me perversely optimistic, and I don't know how much is perverse and how much is valid. What strikes me about the political language that we live inside is it's full of false necessities. And I think if we understand that they're false, it liberates the political imagination. You know, that will it collapse? Well, if you'd ask Czechoslovak or Poles in the middle of the 1980s, will it collapse? It was like Groundhog Day, the feeling this will go on forever and ever and ever, and then it stopped. But it took enormous political activity and engagement to stop. And I think it can be changed. I think like Herman Daly, who argued that social purpose is independently causative in the world. So we don't live in machines. We can make the future what we want. However, the obvious restriction to that is like the Soviet system. We have built some incredibly dysfunctional public and private institutions. And like the Soviet system, they won't just jump to something else. They have path dependencies in them, they have cultures in them, they have incentive frameworks in them that are not going to change overnight. So I think we need to recognize that and go back to the scientific method, which would imply listening and devolving power and going to whichever sector you wanted to go to if you were a government, but ideally a local government. And instead of dictating, ask, what do you need? You would develop a kind of experimentalism where you would develop public policy using the scientific method, where you would take seriously people's experience of where they really are. You would take seriously the real constraints that they face, and then you would say, what do you need? And then you would try and turn that into a methodology.
Okay, thanks very much. And a question here and then over, actually, then online and then over there. Yeah, please.
Nick Barr, longtime colleague of Abby's and a huge fan of this book. Abby, you won't be surprised to hear I'm going to defend economics. You rightly attacked bad economics, and I'm totally with you there, but there's good economics. You said second best seeks to mend the connection. It doesn't. It attempts to make things better. It recognizes that there's no perfect solution. It recognizes that the world is dynamic and changes in unexpected ways. My favorite example is that in the early days of mobile phones, the engineers invented something called SMS, which led via texts to social media and all that followed from that. So second best recognizes all that and sees the role of government as having a substantial reactive element, not, most emphatically, not a prescriptive one. So in a way, my challenge to you is, if we don't go down that route, or if that route of trying to fix identifiable market failures isn't part of the agenda, where else do we go?
Now, Abby, you know Nick quite well and have opportunities to talk to him quite often. So keep it brief now. Throw the book at him later.
You can tell he's the head of my department. I think neoclassical economic insights can be fantastic. I think contract theory and so on, it can be incredibly insightful. So it's not that I'm saying neoclassical economics is useless by any means, but it has absolutely overreached itself. And what we need is analytical pluralism. We need the insights that you get from neoclassical economics, but you also need other accounts that can cope with an evolving three-dimensional world that aren't forms of black-hole determinism. And one of the striking features of neoliberalism is that, ask any professional economist, whether it's in the Bank of England or in the Treasury or whatever, they're often extremely well informed, extremely self-aware of the limits of the methodology. But it's in the nature of the methodology that it defines the nature of problems in these highly restrictive two-dimensional ways, that this is the nature of the market failure, this is the logic of mending the market failure. So it shifts the entire analytical focus of the Treasury, for example, onto that form of reasoning. And it is profoundly insufficient because you can't, for example, even describe financial markets or financialization, let alone solve it. So it's a process of, it's analytically useful, but it's also necessarily, because the methodology, a process of organized forgetting. And what it forgets are most of the observable dynamics of an actual capitalist system. And that is the biggest problem with it, is it, even though it critiques the first best world, it reifies that form of analysis and that understanding of the nature of the economy constantly. So it's very useful, but it's taking...
Maybe also, in a way, universalize it as the only form. Yeah. Okay, exactly. So we've got a question online and Laura will read it out.
I have a question from Maria Pavlo Marshall. She's working on a project about work identity and living a meaningful life. Her question is, do you think that the fact we do not have inspiring or terribly ambitious political figures in today's Britain is a reason that we have not had a revolution as such? or a symptom of the same apathy which leads to a lack of revolution?
Maybe, Raphael, you take that first. And
Yeah, I think the absence of revolution is, I mean, there are, I don't want to be too deterministic about it, but I think there is a pretty profound cultural phenomenon in this country of tolerance for extraordinary levels of sort of deprivation before people start breaking things up, you know, unlike France, for example. I mean, this is most remarkable. But also, I mean, going back to, yeah, I think I was absolutely right about the way the paradigm and sort of the bipartisan agreement on so many of the sort of macro ideological frame of British politics. It means that we don't have, you know, very vastly differing propositions on some of these economic questions. We still do have pluralistic politics, and the ballot box is still the most effective available way to enact regime change. And I think that will happen this year. I'll just make one point very quickly. A very good Russian friend of mine who is not a fan of the current regime in Moscow and is very sad and upset and frustrated and angry about what's going on there, and I speak to him a lot. And I remember complaining to him about Brexit one time on the phone, going, "It's awful, we've done a stupid thing, it's a nightmare." And everyone, the day after the referendum, was just tearing their hair out, going, "How have we done this to ourselves?" And he said, "Look, Raf, I'm sure people were very upset that morning, but at least they got to go to bed the night before not knowing what the result was going to be."
God, that's true. If you want to add anything, though, we move on.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Raphael. I think different countries have different, they get called repertoires of collective action. And the British riot periodically, and I'm surprised that there hasn't been more rioting, because the levels of
It's quite
devastation
illegal now.
that we see, it's also very illegal. And this is one of the arguments in the book, is that the more the neoliberal system is implemented, the more it's the totalizing aspect, nature of it becomes apparent. So the more it fails, the more authoritarian governments have to be to continue it. And I think we're at that stage where public protest, riots, we're you know, messing around with electoral law, ID requirements and so on. We're really getting to that realm.
I think when the Conservative Party is released from the obligation to even try to do responsible government, and the Labour government is failing to fix this stuff, it will get very tasty.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Question over there.
Hello, thank you. So my name's Yanida, and for all my sins, I'm a civil servant. But I'm interested in what you were talking about linking the scientific method to problem solving in policy making. And I say this as a former scientist, and I think most scientists would agree that problem solving in basic scientific research comes with a lot of failure and a lot of inefficiencies. How do we link that to policy making? How do we accept that inefficiency within policy making if we kind of link those two ideas, especially within a political cycle where there are external pressures that won't allow those waste products, if you like?
Thanks so much.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question. And I think it's almost things like that are the hardest aspect of where we've brought ourselves, because we've spoken the language of efficiency for 40 years and cost benefit analysis. And, you know, that is incredible. It absolutely obscures the reality, the inescapable reality that we are fallible, that we can't foretell the future, that the societies we live in are necessarily changing and adaptive and hit by unexpected shocks and pressures. And so you need a margin of error. And you need a margin of analytic, you know, you need to be allowed to fail analytically, but you also need a budget that's a margin of error. And we have pared down the public sector, particularly the welfare state, to the bone in efficiency savings, so that there's no longer the margin of maneuver in, you know, if you get unexpected events, which of course, being human, there will be unexpected events. And now we're cutting into the bone of public institutions, so that, you know, it's really questionable how well they survive. But I think it's one of the most profound problems of how you would change the political culture and political leadership, and the political expectations to society that say, you have to trust the fact that we're trying to do this, and we're building expertise, and we're building new ways of doing things. and that we live in an imperfect and an imperfectible world. And I think after the Second World War, everyone understood that. The war taught everybody that that was the case, and the totalitarian ideologies of communism and fascism taught people that they wanted to live in a more human, imperfect, testing, trying, pragmatic form of system with radical social purpose attached to it. But to get back to that way of thinking about things from the delusions of a scientific form of government is incredibly difficult.
That's lovely and sad. Raf, do you want to add to that?
Actually, no, I just want to come back, actually, very quickly on the point of revolution, because I think there's an important thing that we haven't said that I think is relevant to this, which is that Brexit was, in a sense, a genuine revolution. And I think, and it happened at the ballot box. And it occurs to me that it's very important that when you only get to do that sort of thing once per generation. And so to win a popular mandate for something that massive, that on such false premises that we're so never going to deliver what it promised to do, is such an extraordinary squandering of revolutionary energy. I don't think you get to do that again for a long time. I think that's what's going to be so incredibly difficult for Keir Starmer getting this government. You can't say, sorry, wrong revolution, but we do need to do it all again, because that was, sorry, we just flip the record and play side B, different revolution. And that, I think, is an important part of why we are stuck now with a kind of paradoxical revolutionary ideation in technocratic methods, and I think it's going to be very difficult.
And we're at the end of a paradigm, but without a new paradigm. So what was the revolution before? You know, revolutions tend to have grand visions of the way forward, but we're at the collapsing, dying end of a failed paradigm, and the kind of a revolution of down with this sort of thing would be very English. It's not clear that you could mobilize. So the risk is rage.
And also, just on this point about failure, which I think is incredibly interesting, there are two other things that I would sort of throw into the mix there. One is the decline of deference, which means you just don't simply get, as a civil servant or as a minister, to say, well, we tried this thing, it didn't work, so just give us a moment, we'll have another go at doing something else. People just are frustrated. And the other, I think, is the acceleration of a political cycle. That means the idea of deferred gratification, where you win a mandate, but it's a representative democracy. You say, we'll come back in 4 years' time, you can judge us whether we've got things right. There's a referendum every second on Twitter, and you don't get to do that. You don't get to make those kind of mistakes. So I think there's a technological acceleration and a flattening of hierarchies and a culture of anti-elitism, which is obviously a very good thing in some contexts, but also awkward when you do actually have practical elites and things like science.
Can I ask you what?
Good try though. Yeah, because lots of hands are up. One there, and then we'll take one there.
Thank you for that. It's very interesting. I'm Freya. I'm also a civil servant. Hello. I've just got a question about I want to know your thoughts on how the civil service as a good check and balance has maybe changed over the decades, or if it was ever an effective check and balance towards different ideologies.
I think one of the
things you could think about there is Westminster and things like that, where there was a representation of the civil service as actually the thing that was in charge. And so it was more than check and balances, it was keeping the show on the road when you have all these dreadful politicians. But what that perhaps didn't anticipate was revolutionary politicians.
Well, and it's also part of the caricature of the bureaucracy as somehow this kind of slightly conspiratorial mechanism that would endlessly foil politicians and prevent them from enacting their democratic mandates. So yes, Minister's very funny, but I also think it was part of the problem in terms of this kind of grotesque image of this public institution. I think what's so difficult for, and you can tell me whether this is true or if you can feel able to do that, that because we have re-engineered the nature of the civil service to think in terms of cost-benefit analysis, target setting, managerial lines, and so on, I think the reduction of discretion within the civil service is arguably a real problem in terms of open-minded problem solving, and the idea that you've got time to go and do due diligence on a policy before it has to be enacted. So the speed with which policy is declared and enacted, I think, is something that's very different from old period, and there would have been a lot more testing and you know, real consultation done in the past before things were rolled out into the public sphere. I think it must be, I think also because the state has become a giant of public procurement, that it's possible to be recruited into the civil service only to find that you're managing contracts rather than managing policy.
That's so interesting. Raphael, do you want to?
I think there's so many.
Yeah, take so many more questions. All right, so we've got one here.
Yeah,
and then we'll
I'm
move on.
Gwyn
Yeah.
Behrman. I'm emeritus professor. I was in the Department of Management and I now teach in School of Public Policy. I just want to say what a truly wonderful book this is. It is absolutely fantastic, a major achievement. And what's even more extraordinary, Abby, is the way you summarized it so beautifully at the start. I just think it's truly fantastic. But it's deeply troubling. And the thing that now you have mentioned, and it's the one of the root causes that we've got, of course, there's Milton Friedman's 1970 argument, the radical doctrine should be all the private enterprise should do is maximize profits in the rules of the game. And then there's this lovely book by Katharina Pistor about the capital code, about how we've now changed the rules of the games. You can, through private equity, pay out dividends, drive companies into bankruptcy, and you hold on to the financial gains. Now, of course, the exemplar of that was the global financial crisis, in which the bankers all walked off with huge amounts of money, and the rest of us have paid the price. And I think one of the things you haven't covered, but I mean, you can see both Brexit and Trump as the revolutionary response to the failure of the political classes to deal with that. I do think that the 2010 coalition government was one of the worst we've had in the 21st, well, it's not long in 21st century, but truly appalling. And that was the great window of opportunity where this thing absolutely failed spectacularly, and we did not correct it.
Brilliant. Thanks, Gwyn, for highlighting that. So one of the mirroring aspects is this idea that there's a vanguard in Materialist Utopias that is the bearer of the correct consciousness of the basic system. And in neoliberalism, it's business. So we've sacralized business, that it's a kind of reserved domain where everything can be touched, but not business, because business only operates, whether that's in the financial sector or more broadly large corporations, that will tend towards this kind of productive stewardship of wider welfare. And what neoclassical economics really struggles to imagine is the absolute exploitation of that definition of what corporations are and what they should be. So, for example, what we've seen, and Andrew Haldane, that well-known Trotskyist, he was chief economist of the Bank of England from 2015, was arguing that British companies are basically cannibalizing themselves, that we have this process called financialization, where firms stop being what they were in the post-war period, which was having complex social purposes, and profit was part of it. But what comes with neoliberalism is the maximization of shareholder value at the expense of almost every other activity that firms are really engaged in. And his point was that they'd gone from being socially purposeful agents within free liberal market society to effectively financial vehicles that were highly extractive of finance out of the real economy. So just to give you a statistic that from 2009 to 2018, almost half the FTSE 100 large firms paid out more than 3/4 of their net income, and a quarter distributed more than 100% of their net income. So we're in a situation where a so-called payout ratio, the ratio of dividends to profits, market observers would tend to say anything over 55% is pretty unviable, because you're not reinvesting the money back into the viability of the company, you're not maintaining skills, investment in technology, pensions, and all the rest of it. So we're at a situation where a very large proportion of firms are extracting between 90 and over 100% of their annual profits. It's a completely unsustainable system, and they're under pressure from financial markets to continue to do that. So one of the things that would absolutely have to change for us to live in a more viable, cohesive and thriving society is we have to end the idea that the corporation is a privileged domain. We have to return the idea that firms are part of society, they have to be integrated into society, and they have to be sociable. And today, they also have to be ecological. We have to change their fiduciary duties so that ecological responsibility is part of their formal legal requirements. And I think until we do that, almost everything else we do is a little bit moot, because we're living in a system geared to financial extraction at the expense of literally everybody else.
Sure, I was going to think we have 1 minute for a further question, but actually I think that's quite a good place to stop. And so instead of inviting further questions, which also would have been wonderful, I think we're going to finish on time and get a real opportunity to thank Abby and Raphael for an amazing conversation. Thanks.